Winston Churchill, whom we are also honoring tonight, once said that if you're not a socialist when you're 20, you have no heart, and if you're not a capitalist when you're 40, you have no head. Well, I was halfway between socialism and capitalism when I arrived in Ottawa to drive Prime Minister Brian Mulroney crazy. One of my favorite cartoons, which I still have hanging on my wall at home, is a Globe and Mail script, which is a picture of Prime Minister Mulroney begging, "Isn't pregnancy leave mandatory?" We had our differences in Parliament, but I have to say that when the call came to honor your work in democracy, I couldn't think of a better person to be recognized by the Churchill Society. You managed to stare down Margaret Thatcher and lead the world in getting rid of apartheid. Your relationship with Nelson Mandela was without equal in the world, and you also managed to carve great relationships with leaders of all political stripes in all parts of the world. You truly were a global inspiration, and I'm just so pleased to be a part of this celebration tonight of your life, and in particular your work for democracy and for Canada. In trade, in many, many ways. We didn't always agree, but I have to say that I'm so proud of the legacy that you left for Canada and for democracy, and in particular for your fantastic work in breaking the chains of racism that kept Blacks in South Africa under the heel of whites for so many years. You've got a lot to be proud of, and your family should be very proud of you tonight, and I know that Canada is very proud of you tonight, and those of all political stripes join me in honoring you and in recognizing your contribution to Churchill and democracy.
I want to begin by congratulating Brian on this much-deserved honor. He is indeed an outstanding parliamentarian. He and I were in substantial disagreement over many issues over many years when we were both in the House of Commons. This is to be expected. He was a conservative prime minister, and I was the leader of a social democratic party in the Commons. However, there emerged towards the end of my period as a parliamentarian, when he was prime minister, two matters of singular importance upon which we agreed and about which he showed outstanding leadership. I refer in the first instance to the abominable treatment of so many thousands of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. These Canadians, who were absolutely innocent of any wrongdoing, was well understood by the Canadian Ministry of Defense that they did not in any sense constitute a threat to the security of our nation. In spite of this, their property was taken away, their economic livelihoods were destroyed. They were moved holus bolus, whole families, away from their residences on the West Coast, somewhere else in the interior of Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau had refused to take any action showing an apology towards these Canadians. Brian stepped in as Prime Minister. He took that important initiative in 1988, providing some financial assistance to some 22,000 Japanese Canadians and setting up a multi-million-dollar human rights fund in commemoration of this act. In addition to this outstanding work on behalf of Japanese Canadians, Brian took decisive international action when it came to apartheid. There were other conservative leaders at the time, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, both in power, both ostensibly committed in their opposition to apartheid, but both refusing to do anything about economic sanctions. Brian stepped in and provided real leadership on this issue. In an important meeting of Commonwealth leaders, he took on Margaret Thatcher directly, forcefully, on the issue of sanctions. This was followed up by a barn burner of a speech at the UN General Assembly in 1988 on the same subject. The whole world can thank Brian for the kind of leadership he showed on this issue, and all Canadians in particular will join in appreciation for the issue of leadership on the question of Japanese Canadians. Again, I salute you, Brian, on an award much deserved.
It's an honor for me to visit with you all tonight and join in the tribute to the Right Honorable Brian Mulroney. I can think of no Canadian parliamentarian who deserves the Award of Excellence for the advancement of parliamentary democracy more than Brian Mulroney. Let me tell you why. Others will speak to you tonight about his tremendous success in foreign policy and trade policy and a host of other fundamental issues that were so important to the country. But I want to talk to you about his success as a parliamentarian. In a parliamentary democracy, a leader of a party has to not only lead the party and make it perfectly clear what the priorities are for him and for the country he's trying to lead as prime minister, but he also has to maintain a dynamic, trusting relationship with every member of his caucus. They have to trust him, they have to be on his side, and they have to know that he is on their side. And when I was a member of his staff, when I was his chief of staff, in our prime minister's office during his period in government, the largest group was not the media group, it was not the tour and travel group. The larger group was not the logistics operation or the legislative operation. The largest group of employees in our office were bright young men and women who were part of the caucus relations process. They spoke to caucus every day. They heard from caucus every day. They made sure the prime minister's office and the prime minister knew it was on people's minds. And of course, the prime minister attended caucus regularly every single Wednesday morning. And I think his record of attendance was better than 98%, which I think is pretty compelling. And while a caucus meeting is about discussing issues and coming legislation and dynamics with the opposition parties, one of the most important parts of the meeting takes place actually right after the meeting, when members of caucus go up to the front of the room and talk to the prime minister about matters of direct concern to them and their constituency, their community, whether it was a physical federal facility that needed to be improved, whether it was an immigration matter or a passport matter, whether it was a matter that related to agriculture or local manufacturing. They had a very clear sense that he was there to hear what they were concerned about and that he would engage on their behalf whenever and however he could. And he would take little pieces of paper and make notes to himself as they were talking, or take their cards, or they'd give him a piece of paper about the problem in their riding they wanted to have dealt with. And then when he would come back to the office after caucus, we knew that our first job was to get all the pieces of paper out of his inside pocket and out of his side pocket, because those are the pieces of paper which told us what we had to get busy on, so that the next time he saw caucus or talked to those members of his caucus, he would have an answer for them about the issue they had raised and the concerns that they wanted their prime minister to address. Let me tell you another story, which I think is very indicative of the kind of caucus leader he was. It was a G8 meeting, I think, in 1992. Prime Minister and Mrs. Mulroney and Mila were overseas. And when he was flying back in the old 707, which is a whole other story, he got word that Stan Darling, one of our longest serving members of Parliament, Parry Sound, Muskoka, his wife Mona had passed away. And in fact, that had happened a day or so before the flight took off, and that the funeral would be taking place pretty well an hour or two after he was scheduled to arrive in Canada. So the direction to the Canadian Forces pilot was, don't go to Ottawa, don't go to Uplands, go directly to Muskoka International Airport, which, if you haven't been there, is a very modest airport, but a good pilot can land a large plane there if necessary, which is what he did. And that allowed Prime Minister Mulroney and Mila to walk into that small church in Parry Sound to pay their respects to Mona Darling, and also, of course, to indicate how important to him Stan Darling, the long-serving MP from that part of the world, was. And those are the sorts of things that Brian Mulroney did all the time. It's not generally known that when he and Mila were traveling across the country for events of one form or another, speeches that had to be made, meetings, first ministers, conferences, etc., fundraising dinners for the party, Mila, because of her tremendous work on the issue of cystic fibrosis, as a philanthropist and a leader in that charity, would hear of a young child who was in hospital or a teenager going through a difficult time, and how it would be so important if the Prime Minister could maybe make a call. Well, the Prime Minister and Mila wouldn't just make a call. They would take the car from the train and from the plane and rather than go directly to the hotel, they would stop at the hospital and they would go on in to see the young person and give him or her a little bit of encouragement and to help them, hopefully, to a reasonable, clear-cut recovery. Now, we never told the media about any of those things because the Prime Minister said, we don't want you to do that. That's not why we're doing it. We're not doing it to get points with the media. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do. And this is an important charity and an important part of our life. So that's the Prime Minister that most Canadians perhaps didn't know enough about, but his caucus knew. And that is why that even in the most difficult and challenging of times, the debates on free trade, the debates on the HST, the GST, which were, as you may recall, moments of some controversy and divided opinion in the country, the Conservative caucus, let me use the term appropriately, the Progressive Conservative caucus that Brian Mulroney led was totally loyal to him all the time, as he was to them, because they knew he was loyal to them. And after he would go home to 24 Sussex, with large legal bags full of briefing books and material that he was then going to work on that night. And he'd come upon a briefing note about a constituency issue or a transport or a healthcare or a infrastructure issue in a riding that we happen to hold. Well, he would pick up the phone and say to the switchboard, can you find me John so-and-so, the MP for so-and-so, and get him on the phone? And the Prime Minister would do that every night. And he would talk maybe on 10 or 15 phone calls every night, chatting with people. And of course, he would use the time zone. So he knew when it was too late to call into the Maritimes, but he also knew that he could call onto the West Coast later than he could to most other parts of the country. It was a visceral, humane, determined relationship with his caucus. He trusted them. He depended on them. He knew that the unity of the caucus was the justifying force, if you wish, the way in which his courage on so many important issues, as with others would have spoken about tonight, apartheid, free trade, the GST, the deployment of Canadian forces in support of the Dayton Peace Accords to Bosnia-Herzegovina, on those typical issues and topical and difficult issues, he knew that the caucus had his back, and that ensured that he would have the courage and the determination to carry forward those things which were right for Canada and right for the world. So if the job of a Prime Minister in a parliamentary system is to advance parliamentary democracy, which is what the Prime Minister is receiving his award for tonight, one has to look at how that was done and how hard he worked at it. And I can't think of any Canadian Prime Minister of any affiliation who worked as hard or was as determined to make parliamentary democracy a real dynamic force for progress, for fairness, for stability, and for Canada's national and international interest, which is why it's such a privilege for me to lend a few words to tonight's celebration and make it perfectly clear that for all of those who have received this award in the past, having the Right Honorable Brian Mulroney now be a recipient of this award adds immense luster to the award itself and to the importance of the great work that the Churchill Society for the Advancement of Parliamentary Democracy does every day. Thank you all, and by all means, enjoy the rest of tonight's evening. Thank you.
Good evening. It is a personal pleasure to congratulate Brian Mulroney, the honored guest tonight at the Churchill Society dinner. Brian Mulroney ranks among a tiny group of Canada's prime ministers who led Canada on the world stage and left a footprint far greater than we deserve. Under his leadership, Canada punched far above our weight. When the Prime Minister came to office, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was chilly indeed. The tense relationships between the two superpowers led to a frightening incident in 1983 that alarmed even the measured and calm President Reagan. The president then became preoccupied with the risk of an accidental war with Moscow, and frankly, had little time or interest in Canada. At the same time, in Congress, protectionist sentiment was alive and very well. Prime Minister Mulroney changed all of that. First, he established a close and warm personal relationship with President Reagan. And that relationship paid off because President Reagan threw his political weight behind a very broad Canada-US free trade agreement that came into force in 1989, and the subsequent North American free trade agreement that came into force a few years after. Everyone in Canada, I think, would agree that these agreements changed the trajectory of the Canadian economy, created the deeply integrated North American supply chains that we all know today, and allowed Canadians to benefit from unfettered access to North American markets. And all of this while preserving Canada's sovereignty and our distinctive culture. It truly was a game changer. We've never looked back since. Free trade with the United States is so widely and deeply accepted by Canadians across the political spectrum today that it enjoys broad and deep bipartisan support. And when it was threatened by President Trump, across the political spectrum, we built a whole of Canada coalition to fight to retain the benefits that Prime Minister Mulroney made possible. We owe him a great debt of gratitude. Prime Minister Mulroney was also an early environmentalist. He was a strong supporter at the first Rio Summit, the climate change conference, the early one that was organized by the United Nations. It was his leadership that enabled the agreement with the United States to prevent acid rain, an agreement that still benefits Canadians and Americans who live close to our borders today. Prime Minister Mulroney is recognized around the world for his early and fierce opposition to the apartheid regime in South Africa. A passionate supporter of the Commonwealth, the Prime Minister led a delicate dance at Commonwealth meetings with the United Kingdom, with its Prime Minister, and even with the Queen, where he communicated his principled opposition to the institutionalized system of racial discrimination that was South Africa at that time. He managed to move the leadership of the Commonwealth, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and even discreetly the Queen, while still preserving Canada's relationships with all of them. No small accomplishment. Finally, on a more personal note, I know that Prime Minister Brian Mulroney recognized the dangers of anti-Semitism and fought against it, both during the time he was Prime Minister and long after he left the Prime Minister's office. I had the privilege as director of the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy to see up close his willingness to step up and speak out when anti-Semitism reared its ugly head, as it does again and again in each generation. His unstinting support was of a piece with his principled opposition to discrimination of any kind. It is this principled opposition that makes Brian Mulroney one of the great prime ministers that Canada is fortunate enough to have had. Congratulations, Mr. Prime Minister, on your award this evening.